And welcome to What Now? Today, our focus is on leadership in Japan, now in the hands of the first female prime minister in the country's history. And also on What Now, a look at the 5-year jail sentence of former French President Nicolas Sarkozy for soliciting funds from fallen Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi during his 2007 campaign for leadership. That's our major focus today on What Now? And let's begin with that story. I am Precious Amayu. Former President of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, has begun a 5-year jail sentence in Paris for soliciting funds from the late Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi during his 2007 campaign. Mr. Sarkozy, who was president from 2007 to 2012, has appealed against his jail term at La Santé prison, where he will occupy a small cell in his isolation wing. More than 100 people applauded and shouted Nicolas as he left his villa in the exclusive 16th district of Paris, holding his wife, Carla Bruni Sarkozy, by the hand. The 70-year-old continues to protest his innocence, maintaining he has no doubt truth will prevail. And now for more on the jailing of the former French president, a journalist in Northern Ireland, Francis Hughes, joins me on the news. Good to have you join us.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Now, according to the judgment, President Sarkozy, or former President Sarkozy, will go to jail whether or not an appeal is launched. And his sentence has sharply divided France. How unprecedented and justified is this ruling?
It's a very unusual case in itself. If you look at the facts, he's been brought before the court. He's been found guilty. He has been sentenced to a custodial 5 years in prison. He maintains his innocence. He claims that there is almost a witch hunt to try and convict him on any basis of any crime for some deep state reason. But, you know, one of the main questions here isn't necessarily about Sarkozy himself or the money coming from Gaddafi, but the wider political reverberance is corruption in political management. I mean, how many other people have received money from other outside agencies in order to have influence on domestic and foreign policy and the elections of the presidential leaders and indeed prime ministers around the world? If we look at AIPAC, surely somebody in America should be looking into the Senate, the Congress, and Donald Trump's financial dealings with AIPAC, which is seen by many as a foreign agent working within the American political administration. So it actually asks more questions than it answers. Is it about corruption, or is it about alliances with Gaddafi prior to the war on Libya carried out by NATO in 2011?
And just that factor that you mentioned, the Gaddafi factor in all of this, does this speak to the hypocrisy of the West? Because he was tagged a dictator, eventually, you know, taken out. And now we find that monies were being solicited for a diplomatic favor, you know, in Europe. And I'm just wondering if that speaks to the hypocrisy on how that particular situation in Libya was handled.
Well, that's absolutely the right question to be asking. I mean, the political front in the West, the democracies that we supposedly live under, they enjoy less than 20% of trust within the population of many of these European countries. People here do not trust politicians. There are cases in Britain where during COVID, financial monies were given to companies and individuals that were closely associated with members of the British government and indeed the Prime Minister. That's corruption, or appears to be corruption in itself. So the fact that this is about Gaddafi, it's the destruction of Libya by NATO on behalf of oil corporations and other capitalist imperialist quangos who wanted to steal the natural resources of Libya for the enrichment of the global north and the impoverishment of the global south. So hypocrisy has been exposed by what's happened with Sarkozy. Surely we can ask the question, why isn't this happening in America? Why hasn't it happened in Germany? Why isn't it happening in many other countries throughout the world where you can have the best politics that money can buy, and you have people like Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant who have international criminal warrants issued in their names, able to travel freely to the United States and European countries when they should be in front of the Hague.
And we will get to Sarkozy in just a moment, but do you think that this particular case would have any influence on how the rest of the world interprets the narrative of maybe the West, whether the US or Europe, on about any country or about any leader? Whether it's, for example, Russia, President Trump would always say, look, Europe needs to stop buying Russian oil if it really wants to stifle its economy in a way that it stops prosecuting the war in Ukraine. And people are wondering why that hasn't happened. Will this have an overall influence on how the rest of the world interprets the narrative of the West?
Well, what we're looking at appears to be an isolated case. This is a one-off. I know there are several cases against Sarkozy, and he has been convicted previously of corruption in politics due to overspending on his financial presidential campaigns. But the fact are, I mean, this is one previous president of France. This is one isolated case within the European Union. It's not the beginning of an avalanche. It's not a beginning of cleaning the swamp, as they talk about in Washington. This is simply, for whatever reason, the French state going after Sarkozy. But I think it is business as usual in the rest of the world, sadly.
And let's get back to Sarkozy. He said he felt a deep sorrow for France, which finds, and I'm quoting him, which finds itself humiliated by the expression of a vengeance that has taken hatred to an unprecedented level. I'm just wondering, does this suggest that in his case, that justice is blind and applies to everyone, or that justice is selective?
I don't believe justice is blind in any nation or national sovereign state. I believe judges, in my personal opinion, can follow the deep state inclinations. These people are put into these positions of power by the state, so they are sometimes kind of held by the state to remember who put them in place. So I don't have any real faith in the political system. I believe it's political theatre. I don't have any real faith in the judicial system. I have seen the whitewashes of murders in my own country by the judiciary, and indeed the Guildford Four sent to prison for life sentences. The judge said, if I had the death penalty, I would make you all executed. All turned out to be innocent, all framed by the state. I don't really have any faith in the political system or the judicial system as it appears today.
But he has a relationship with President Macron. I mean, he was with President Macron just recently before this sentence. Doesn't that suggest that perhaps there was no government interference in this case?
Well, I'm not prior to the conversation. I don't know what was said. I don't know what went on between those two gentlemen in a closed room. Is there a deal being done in the background? Why would a current president bring into the Elysee Palace a former president who's now been convicted of political corruption? I assume there's wheeling and dealing going on in the background that we're not aware of.
And what is the optics of that?
Well, the optics are, can you trust the people in power when they're sitting down having a private conversation with people who have just been convicted on corruption charges of political corruption within the system? It just makes the whole kind of situation and the whole political edifice just seems to be falling apart in front of our eyes. Why would a current president sit with someone convicted of political corruption as if nothing has changed? It is business as usual. Or is there something Macron's worried about that Sarkozy might bring into the public domain?
And you also find that, I think it's one of the cabinet ministers who has also said he will pay a visit to the former president Sarkozy in prison, and that got a lot of French people speaking as to why the government continues to maintain that relationship with him, even though he has now been convicted. I just want to also get your reaction to that, what it means for President Macron, who's ratings has continued to drop.
Yes, well, this isn't going to help matters. You know, the very fact that he's consorting with a now convicted criminal, I can only assume that there are things in the background that obviously we're not party to, obviously that we're not informed about. And the fact that a current minister and a current president are spending time with a convicted felon, we have to ask the question, is there something we don't know? Is there something going in the background? Are they giving him this time? Are they giving him their energy and their commitment in order to potentially reassure him about what's going to happen at the appeal? Are they reassuring him that he won't be in prison for very long? Are they reassuring him if he plays along with the game that somehow his sentence might be commuted? This is all speculation, but the very fact that there's no other information in the public domain, apart from the fact that they continue to meet in itself, opens the Pandora's box as to what actually else is happening in political society in France that we're unaware of.
Francis Hughes, I'm going to put you on hold as we take a break now. When we return, we will continue this conversation. Stay with us, everyone. Thanks for staying with us, everyone. You're watching What Now? We've been talking about the former President of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, who has been sentenced to 5 years in prison for allegedly soliciting campaign funds from late leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. Now, we've been speaking with a journalist from Northern Ireland. He is Francis Hughes, and he joins us from Northern Ireland. Good to have you as join us, and thank you for staying with us. I just was, going through, some comments being made about this particular case, and I had one from a French journalist who has said that Nicolas Sarkozy he was very used to cutting the press, power and money, and that in the end, all of those three elements brought him down. And I'm just wondering what you make of that.
Well, if we could maybe just focus on the trial again, just for 1 second. I mean, I think he was convicted for spending twice the amount of money that he was legally allowed to do when he was trying to get re-elected in 2012. So of all this money that's supposed to have been brought in for his election campaign in 2007, there must be a paper trail for that. You can't have TV advertising, you can't have things in newspapers, you can't have mass rallies without there being receipts, without that money being handed over. So it appears in his trial that the judge's ruling partially relies on not only did he not have to have that money be given to him, but it was the very fact that there may have been talks that there would be financial aid given to his election campaign, that is seen to be a conspiracy. And he wasn't charged in isolation. There were two other ministers at that particular time in that particular government who have also been charged. So, the prosecution seemed quite flimsy, but the very fact that conspiracy doesn't mean the money has to be handed over, the fact that people are talking about it is enough for a charge of conspiracy to be held. But anyone in the public eye, anyone in public office, anyone who is seen to be corrupt or corruptible can be built up by the press, but also then dragged down by the press. So a public persona is always going to be open to attack and vilification. And if there is justification for his incarceration, then so be it. But as we've said, it's a total hypocrisy when people in America, in the Congress and in the Senate, and indeed presidents of America and other leaders in the West accept financial contributions from people who have vested interests and then expect them to be held to account in power, like the military industrial complex, like Apex, like Zionist finances that help propel many people into power. And Macron could be a perfect example of someone who was plucked from obscurity and then within, I believe, I could be wrong now, the Rothschild banking system, and ended up the president of France. Who's in the background? They say it's not the king, it's the person who whispers in the king's ear, or in this case, the president's ear, that has the power. So who really has the power and who's really making the decisions is what this particular case has brought to light in Europe and in a corrupt Western democratic cabal.
Now, former President Sarkozy is really not into politics anymore. He's been trying to form a coalition with a far-right party for a while. That hasn't really picked up. So does this Senate have any consequence for his reputation and career?
Well, he's kind of sidestepped politics. He's supposed to be an influencer. He obviously still has power and position and gravitas as a former president. He will have connections throughout industry, throughout the military industrial complex, and throughout the financial world in France and in the EU. So he's still a very powerful person. But the fact he's now been convicted and incarcerated in jail, awaiting appeal, it could be a simple question of people do not want to be tainted by association. So people may well keep their distance. And it looks like he's now in the political wilderness. But you can never discount people politically. When we've seen people come back in previous campaigns, I don't think he'll ever be re-elected as president, but I'm not sure he's going to spend that long in jail. He's going to be in isolation. But someone who's previously been in that prison and being in that wing of the prison have described it as like a basic Euro motel, and he's supposed to have his police guard 24 hours a day to keep him safe in prison. So he may lose his liberty, but I don't think the man's in any danger of suffering any malfeasance within the prison, and I'm not sure he's actually going to be there that long.
And the fact that his wife is also being tried for alleged witness tampering, how does that tie into this?
Yeah, well, it just depends how you view the whole prosecution in itself, because one of the main people responsible for this trial, or this case coming to trial, was one of the people who claimed to have brought suitcases with up to €5 billion worth of money to France and to Sarkozy and or his associates. He then recanted that. So the prosecution is trying to say, well, obviously he's only withdrawing his sworn affidavit and statements under duress from third parties, which they're claiming that possibly Sarkozy's wife and other associates are involved in, or potentially the man is recanted because what he said wasn't true, and that if this is a state prosecution with a hidden agenda, then obviously they're going to defend their prosecution to the hilt, even if that involves opening other investigations to try and protect the conviction that they have. So without being party to all the inner kind of machinations that are going on, it's very difficult. We can only surmise, and we can only judge things going by what's in the public domain. And I imagine there's more held privately than there's ever going to be publicly exposed. So we're never going to see the real extent of the corruption, or the suspected corruption, or the financial and military web that goes from France through the EU to Libya and back again.
And I was speaking earlier about this in the context of the reputation of former President Sarkozy, but now let's just look at it in the context of, broadly for France, and how much damage this does to his reputation, considering that the country has been dealing with economic woes and political woes recently.
Western democracy is falling apart in front of our eyes. If anything, the genocide and ethnic cleansing on Gaza has exposed the complicity of Western governments in the continuing colonial imperialist resource theft from the global south. So the masks have come off. The lies and duplicity that is peddled by mainstream media and governmental media organizations such as the BBC and maybe France 24 and others, they are exposed as part of a propaganda machine that I believe the global populace and the global electorate are beginning to waken up to. The blinkers are off. We can see the lies and the duplicity. How many times in opposition have people prior to election claimed what they're going to do on behalf of the populace, rehousing, health, finances, taxes, ending wars. Trump said he would end the war in Ukraine. He said he would end the war in Gaza. Then these people get into power, and exactly the opposite happens. So the hypocrisy of Western political theatre is being exposed, not by mainstream media, not even necessarily by social media, but by the very fact that people will tell you barefaced lies. People elected into government are lying to their populations, and we now see that, and we now see the deceit, and we now see the corruption and the lies and the positioning for what it is, and people are starting to realise this cannot continue much longer, and will demand justice against the system that is unjust against its people.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us. The journalist Francis Hughes will continue to monitor that development in France. A pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much.
All right, we're staying in Europe, where Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says intense Russian drone and missile strikes on cities of his country have left at least 6 people dead, including 2 children. He mentioned that 21 persons were wounded in another night of attacks, which he says proves Russia has not come under enough pressure for continuing with the war. As earlier, the US president said he had shelved his plans for an immediate summit with a Russian leader in Budapest because he does not want his time to be wasted. That's What Now Today. We are monitoring developments around the world and bring you the biggest stories tomorrow with a very sound and brilliant analysis. Thanks for watching. I am Precious.